My uncle left me a shifty little bar in his will. There's another door in the back room. You might have guessed it already, but I've had my bar for a long time, and by now, I actually consider myself a pretty alright owner. I've gotten to know all the regulars. I learned how to mix a couple of good drinks, and I even made up one of my own, although that didn't work out very well, especially for those poor souls who pitied me enough to give it a try. I am so sorry, Danica. My point is, after I had properly adjusted to the bar's needs and those of my employees, a lot of things came much easier to me. I started working a lot harder as well. I saw to it that the bar got as clean as possible, which wasn't all that clean, but it's the thought that counts. And I even hung up a couple of pictures and signs here and there. That's not to say I suddenly became a pro or anything, mind you. There were still things I didn't find out until later. For example, there was one letter left by my uncle that was a little more thoroughly sealed in its envelope than most of the others. Mac had scribbled something on its back. Quote, "Don't read this until you've seen the real Irene." Now, that obviously got me thinking, and not only because it rhymed a little. I mentioned Irene before, the lady who allegedly was in the bar on my very first night, too. Andrick poured her a glass of wine back then and told me that for some reason, she would always be welcome here. The weirdest thing about that was that I couldn't see the woman he was talking about. At first, I thought she wasn't there at all, thinking Andrick was just pulling my leg. But that was before I found the letter Mac had told me not to read yet. After that, I made a few attempts to question the bar's spirits about it, but it didn't get me anywhere. That was until one late summer night. It had been a particularly pleasant day at the bar and one of the rare occasions on which we got a couple of new patrons. It was a group of guys bar hopping, and we'd apparently not been the first establishment on their route since they came in singing and laughing. They were extremely upbeat and asked May, Danica, and myself to sit with them for a few minutes. There weren't many other patrons in there at the time, so I figured there'd be no harm in joining them for a bit. I won't lie. It was fun talking to them, despite them being buzzed. At least until Andrick came over with an uncomfortable look on his face. "Hey, could you please stop being so loud? Irene doesn't like the noise." "Well, tell Irene to leave then," May replied, shooting him an angry glance before returning to beaming at the man she'd been chatting to. "It's a bar. Things get lively." Andrick sighed. "Julia, would you please?" "I think Julia is just as involved in this conversation as we are. She's with us on this." May cut him off, which I'm only mentioning because of how rare it is for her to show me any form of companionship. I was almost sad to turn her down. "Hey, sorry guys, but I think if it's bothering Irene, we should probably keep it down. About time to hop on over to the next bar for you anyways, isn't it?" The boys got on their way and May stared at me like she wanted to murder me, but I didn't want to risk disrespecting the invisible entity that was said to be sitting at the counter with a glass of wine. Andrick seemed content, and I followed him behind the counter to talk. "So, what did Irene say?" "Oh, just that she'd like to have some peace and quiet for the night. She was very apologetic about even asking," he sighed. "I kinda hate that May doesn't care about her," he added in a lower voice. "She's being really insensitive." "Why are we whispering?" I answered in a similarly quiet tone. "Well, I don't want her to hear," he uttered, glancing over at the glass of wine on the counter with a quick smile. He then leaned in and whispered in my ear, "I don't want her to be upset. She's had it rough, you know. You've got to be careful with dead people who've suffered a tragic loss of life. They can be very fragile. And when they experience intense emotions, they can get destructive. So you're worried she's gonna run rampant in here or something? Wait, that'd make her a ghost, right?" "Oh, she's a ghost, all right. And yes, but I feel sorry for her too. I'm not sure you're ready to hear about what happened to her." His voice trailed off and he glanced down at me uncertainly. "No, I'm ready. Tell me." Andrick still looked a tad apprehensive, but eventually he shrugged and shook his head as though he was trying to chase a thought away. Yeah, well, not right in front of her. How about after work? I spent the rest of the night staring at that lonely wine glass. It was an eerie sight up there all by itself on the countertop. Once we had cleaned up after closing, I announced to 3/4 of the backroom people that they'd be having some extra time to chill upstairs. At least that decision was met with mild approval. Bo and May sat down in the back so they could watch TV without craning their necks, and Danica started reading one of my books again. Andrick and I, however, made our way to the back room. In my first post, I mentioned that there's another door down in the basement where the employees sleep. I haven't written about it since because there simply hasn't been any reason to. When Andrick led me over to it that night, though, I wondered how in the world I'd been able to forget about it up until that point. All right, so what you should know is that there's a reason that this door stays shut, he began. There's something behind it that has to do with how Irene died. I felt a chill run down my spine. What is it? I muttered. Is it trying to get out or something? Andrick stifled a chuckle. No. It's probably nothing like you imagine. It's not a living, breathing thing. It's more of a scene. I don't get it, I confessed. I know, it's complicated. Andrick paused to rub his forehead in thought. I might not be the right person to tell you this, but why not? Your family obviously didn't end up with 4 household spirits and a bar that attracts freaks. I mean, our dear regulars. Simply by accident. There was some planning involved. Lots of studying certain lost arts and a lot of difficult decision-making, for better or for worse. What I'm trying to say is, your ancestors were pretty deep into some dark stuff. The kind that messes with your head and drives you to do some very bad things. Like what? I asked. He sighed and slowly reached out for the door handle. Like murder. He pulled and the door swung open wide. It was accompanied by an eerily loud and drawn-out creaking noise, reminiscent of some sort of crying animal. To my surprise, the dim light coming in from the larger room illuminated the small chamber rather well. The first thing I was greeted with, however, was a waft of stale air mixed with various odd fragrances ranging from flowery to sickly sweet. Then I saw it. The image in front of me didn't even register with me at first. When it did, the room around me seemed to spin for a few seconds. I felt bile rise in my throat, my footing lost. I staggered and almost fell on my back, but Andrick quickly grabbed me by the arms to steady me. I won't pretend like I'm some kind of fearless hero, but I don't consider myself squeamish, especially after some of the things I've seen, yet whenever I think of that little chamber in the back room, my stomach turns almost exactly like it did when I first saw it. Inside the tiny room, propped up against the wall like some sort of bizarre, life-sized doll abandoned by a careless child, sat a body. It was almost completely naked, except for a large, thin blanket that had been wrapped around it. Its arms and legs, if indeed it had any, were obscured by that same blanket it was cocooned in, so that only its shoulders, neck, and head stuck out. Its skin was brown and looked like strained leather. Its face held no eyes. There were merely 2 empty sockets staring back at me, and its mouth was opened unnaturally wide, twisted into a silent scream. There were bits of hair clinging to its shriveled scalp, though I couldn't tell if they were fake or not. They resembled long, white yarn rather than actual human hair. The rest of the small space was filled with jars and jugs, so many that they had to have been stacked on top of one another in places. Some were made of glass, allowing me to see their contents, mostly dark powders of sorts, but Also various liquids I didn't recognize but assumed to be oils. I stared at the wrapped-up corpse in horror, too terrified to move or even speak up. I would have liked to have asked Andric to shut that freaking door again, but I simply couldn't move my lips. The longer I looked at it, the more details I noticed, such as the burnt-down candle stumps in one of the glass jars and the weird symbols that seemed to be both sewn and painted on the mummy's blanket. Eventually, Andric let go of my shoulders, wary of whether I was going to stumble again or not, and reached out to shut the door. Thankfully, my legs remained beneath me this time. I suddenly had to gasp for air, realizing I'd been holding my breath for a few seconds. The image of that twisted, disfigured body was still fresh in my mind, but I already felt a little better just because the thing itself wasn't right in front of me anymore. "Are you okay?" Andric asked. It took me a moment before I was able to reply to him. "What was that?" I breathed. Sadly, that was Irene, or rather, what's left of her. He gave me a regretful look. "Let's get you back upstairs." Back in the actual bar, I sat down on one of the bar stools and placed my still reeling head on the countertop. After a while, I got up to drink some water, which finally made me feel a little more refreshed. One of the bar spirits had opened the windows so I'd have some fresh air, and I gratefully sucked it inside me. Once I had recovered, I told the four of them to go to sleep. I myself wasn't quite ready to go home though. Instead, I took out the letter and read, again, quote, "Don't read this until you've seen the real Irene," and carefully freed it from its envelope. I had expected a long story again, but the writing was rather brief. It said, "Dear Julia, if you're reading this, that means you've seen the little chamber and what's inside. I told you not to read this until then so you wouldn't go looking for it. I saw it way too early in my life and it gave me nightmares. I didn't want the same thing to happen to you. But now, I suppose the damage is already done. So, I bet you're wondering why she's down there." The answer to that is about as unclear as it is dissatisfying. And that is, we're not sure. By that, I mean neither I nor the bar spirits know the exact answer. What we do know is that Irene was once, a very long time ago, a member of our family, an early ancestor, so to speak. Sometime before the bar came to be, and even before we acquired the Four Hearth spirits, she was chosen to be killed as a human sacrifice. Her body was embalmed, but as you might have guessed, other ways to preserve it were used, unnatural ways. Saying it was magic that mummified her feels silly, but you get my point. When I first stumbled across her, I asked my dad about her. He couldn't tell me any more than what I just told you, though. He said he assumed her body had just been stashed away inside the bar ever since the building had been erected. It's all very strange to me, and I guess to all of us, but at least now you know. As for why she was killed, I have a theory. As you know, the new saloon oftentimes attracts strange creatures, strange people, or people in strange situations. Maybe Irene is the reason why. Maybe the remains of a person killed and preserved by unearthly means and for unearthly purposes act like a beacon or an invitation to things unknown. It's just a thought of mine, but perhaps that's why they're all here. The letter wasn't signed. I remember thinking Uncle Mac must have been so lost in contemplation when he wrote it that he just forgot. On my way home that night, I felt dreadful. Neither the contents of that letter nor the small chamber left my mind, nor would they anytime soon. One more thing changed that night, however. From then on, every time Andric poured a glass of wine, I could see who it was for. An older lady in a weirdly fashioned dress, sitting on one of the bar stools, her head hung and her eyes downcast. Irene wasn't there every day, but she came by quite often. For the longest time, I avoided the gaze of those eyes. I didn't want to think about her. neither her fate nor the remains down behind the back room. Then one day, she spoke to me, but I won't be writing about that just yet.